Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Glen Howard. I'm the president of the Jamestown Foundation. We're delighted that you're joining us here today for the start of Terrorism Watch Week at Jamestown. We will have a series of events this week, and they'll be presented mostly online, but also here in person at Jamestown headquarters in Washington, D.C. As part of the series that we're having today, the title of our lead-off event is called The Future of al-Qaeda After Zawahiri. Joining us will be Dr. Bruce Hoffman and Michael Vickers. Many of you know these distinguished experts from attending our previous terrorism conferences over the years that have spanned over better part of a decade. Today, our first speaker will be Bruce Hoffman, who's been studying terrorism for over 5 decades, which is quite a long time. He's now a professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service, where he directs the Center for Jewish Civilization, teaches Security Studies Masters of, and teaches in the Security Studies Masters of Arts degree program. He's also a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, also senior fellow at the U.S. Military Academy. He's the author of Inside Terrorism, which is now in its 3rd edition. And he has, and this book has been cited with 25 most notable books published by Columbia University Press. He's also the author of The Evolution of Global Terrorist Threat 2014 and forthcoming book called Blood, Patriots, and Tyranny, A History of American Far-Right Terrorism, which will be published in early 2024. He holds degrees in government history and international relations, received his doctorate from Oxford University. Our other speaker, which will be joining us, is Dr. Michael Vickers, and Dr. Michael Vickers is widely recognized as one of the United States' top national security professionals with distinguished career serving both Republican and Democratic administrations. He was also a key operational strategist for the 2 great wars of our time, the operation in the 1980s to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan. And he's also played a major role in planning the operation that killed Osama bin Laden. That was from January 2011 to May 2015. Michael Vickers served as Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. So he's had this wonderful career, but most importantly, his memoirs are coming out very shortly, early next year. The title of his memoir is By All Means Available, Memoirs of a Life in Intelligence, Special Operations, and Strategy. As many of you know, the death of Ayman al-Zawahiri in August 2nd of this year was a tremendous blow and setback to al-Qaeda. Zawahiri was involved in the planning of the U.S. 9/11 attacks that killed nearly 3,000 Americans. No one knows the history of al-Qaeda and of Zawahiri better than Bruce Hoffman. And Bruce will be talking today about the evolution and history of al-Qaeda and what it means today. What are the challenges for the United States in those areas and other issues? And we look forward to also note that we'll have questions online as well once the 2 presenters today have finished their part of the discussion. So, Bruce, the floor is yours. Thank you for coming.
Great. Thanks very much, Glenn, for the kind invitation. It's great to be back at least semi in person. Before I begin, let me acknowledge that we don't have a good friend of ours with us today who was at all these previous conferences, and that's Dr. Michael Ryan, who passed away last August, and whose loss has really impoverished the field of terrorism studies, and especially the Salafi jihadi mindset and ideology. Michael was really a giant in that respect. There's no one better. So thinking about al-Qaeda after al-Zawahiri is challenging, and actually I've been reminded of then Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld's famous observation of about exactly 20 years ago, when he said there are known knowns, there are known unknowns, there are unknown unknowns. And I think with all humility, that's how one has to approach the study of terrorism generally these days, because it's evolving the way it has. And often it's very difficult to track some of the changes. I mean, in the known categories, I think that's pretty obvious. And that's counterterrorism is no longer the preeminent national security priority for the United States. Obviously, from the 2018 National Defense Review, there was a shift to great power competition, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with China saber rattling with Taiwan, with Iran's ongoing nuclear development, certainly North Korea as well. There's plenty of reason why terrorism doesn't have the priority it once had. But of course, something like that is the best possible news for groups like al-Qaeda. And I would also argue ISIS, even though that's not the focus. So let's move on to the known knowns, as it were. Well, the known knowns are clearly that al-Qaeda is weaker than it's ever been. Glenn, you mentioned the targeted assassination of Ayman al-Zawahiri last summer, but of course, I think singularly impressively, over the past 3 years, the United States or its allies have eliminated 8 other top al-Qaeda commanders or senior leaders, including Hamza bin Laden, the heir apparent to al-Zawahiri, Abdullah Ahmed Abdullah, was killed in July 2020 in Tehran, and what one reads in the newspapers was a joint CIA Mossad operation, would have been, I think, one of the other most likely leaders. So all that has clearly weakened the organization and thinned out its bench. But firstly, the US shift away from counterterrorism, its priority, creates new opportunities for al-Qaeda. And I think especially the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan roughly 18 months ago has incontestably breathed new life into the movement and means that the threat that it poses, even if it's not completely imminent. And of course, this was something that the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Christine Abizaid, said in testimony on the Hill just last month, which I think is absolutely right, that the threat to the homeland from al-Qaeda is certainly not palpable and not present. But what concerns me is that over time, that may change. And the reason that concerns me is because, let's face it, al-Qaeda won. Right? In the test of wills against the United States in the war on terror, al-Qaeda is weaker, but it wasn't eliminated. Of course, going back 21 years ago, that was precisely the goal of the war on terrorism, which was to eliminate vastly expanded, or exaggerated, all terrorist groups with global reach. But al-Qaeda was certainly not one of them. I mean, it outlasted ISAF, which was folded nearly a decade ago, and it outlasted the United States. And let's put that in its right context. Al-Qaeda has survived the greatest onslaught against the terrorist organization in the history of mankind by the most technologically advanced military in the history of mankind. So from its perspective, it has a winning narrative. Bin Laden told us this, in fact, in October 2004, in one of his last publicly released videotape statements. He said that he knew that al-Qaeda could not defeat the US on the battlefield, but he predicted that al-Qaeda would eventually triumph in a war of attrition. And just like the power and strength of Mujahideen in the 1980s had led to the defeat of the Red Army in Afghanistan and its withdrawal from that country, which set in motion the collapse of the Soviet Union and the demise of communism really as an overriding global ideology, he predicted he would do the same things in the United States, that he would bankrupt the United States, send our daughters and sons homes in body bags, and eventually undermine support for the war on terror. Given that al-Qaeda sees this struggle as a divinely ordained one, that they cannot lay down their arms because it's divinely commanded, they're not going to give up. And in fact, in their narrative today, they can boast that their persistence and perseverance, just as the Taliban brags, has gotten them everything they could possibly want. The Taliban has been restored to power. Al-Qaeda once again has a resurrected sanctuary and safe haven, which is, I'll come back to, which is of utmost importance to terrorist groups. It actually has really, in the long term, very few limits or constraints. I think right now the Taliban is desperate for financial aid and international recognition. And there's, I think, a quid pro quo where groups under its aegis like al-Qaeda are not engaging actively in international terrorism. That doesn't mean they're not plotting and planning. But I think over time that will change. At least 5,000 al-Qaeda operatives were freed from Afghan prisons over the summer of 2021, including, at least by some estimates, I've seen 2 dozen, 3 dozen al-Qaeda senior leaders that were also imprisoned in Pul-e-Khari and in Bagram. And then, I mean, we can debate everything that I've said, but what's proof positive that al-Qaeda has the famous baseball commentator Red Barber used to say is now in the catbird seat, is the fact that some of its closest friends and allies control the key ministries in Afghanistan. Sirajuddin Haqqani, the leader of the autonomous network, one of the most challenging terrorist networks in the world, has probably the most important government post, at least so far as security is concerned in Afghanistan, as Interior Minister with responsibility over Afghanistan's police, borders, and attendant internal security apparatus. Of course, he's been listed for years, designated by the State Department and the United Nations as a terrorist, and the State Department has offered a $10 million reward for his capture. His uncle, Khalil al-Rahman Haqqani, is the Taliban Minister of Refugees and has a $5 million reward from the State Department on his end. Abdul Haq Wazik, the Taliban's Director of Intelligence, and Khairullah, the Minister of Information and Culture, have both also been sanctioned by the UN and spent a large period of time, forgetting the exact number now, but as prisoners at Guantanamo Bay as detainees. They were released roughly a decade ago, and the prisoner swap that freed 5 Taliban for the US Army Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, who the Taliban was holding. Wazik was responsible for overseeing foreign fighters under al-Qaeda's aegis in the pre-9/11 period, and was responsible for their training camps in Afghanistan. Kirkwar was similarly very close with bin Laden and had long-standing al-Qaeda ties. And then another Haqqani, Yahya, who's very active today, was the Haqqani network's key POC, prime contact with al-Qaeda since 2009. So in many respects, I think we're kind of back to the future in the 1990s, when there was an optimism that a long-distance counterterrorism strategy in Afghanistan could keep al-Qaeda at bay. And when we believed what the Taliban promised us, that they would in essence restrain al-Qaeda. And we've already seen how false that was, because al-Qaeda's most important Central Asian allies played a critical force multiplying role in the Taliban's victory. This is the Islamic Jihad Union, the Turkmenistan Islamic Movement, Kaitab Imam al-Bukhari, among others. Many of those al-Qaeda fighters have been integrated now into Taliban Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Defense units. Many of them have been given important, or well, maybe not important, but in some cases important, in other cases they've been appointed to key administrative duties in at least 8 provinces in Afghanistan. So clearly al-Qaeda's presence, and one could argue even seminal role in the Taliban's governance, is incontested. I think a lot about al-Qaeda's future after al-Zawahiri will depend on the effectiveness of the Biden administration's over-the-horizon strategy, which some intelligence operatives have been anonymously quoted as describing as over the rainbow rather than over the horizon. I think some reasons that we have to be cautious about the effectiveness of that strategy is its first time out of the gate, in essence, in Afghanistan, was of course only a few days after the suicide attack by the Islamic State in Khorasan against the Karzai International Airport. And in hopes of disrupting what was believed to be an ISK plot to carry out another suicide attack, a US drone strike killed 10 Afghan civilians, including 7 children. Now, the assassination of al-Zawahiri has been heralded in many quarters as proof positive that the over-the-horizon strategy can work. Maybe. I think it's still, I'll be agnostic and say it's still too soon to know. In my view, and of course Mike knows much more about this stuff than I do, so I'll be interested to hear his opinion. But I mean, al-Zawahiri was hiding in plain sight. He was living in a villa associated with the Haqqanis. He felt secure and comfortable enough, firstly, to return to Afghanistan almost immediately after the Taliban's victory, or shortly after the Taliban's victory. He took his morning constitutional out on the balcony. So in addition to the very formidable signals and imagery intelligence that the United States, of course, can call upon, this was probably an instance where you could have put eyes on the target itself, human eyes on the target, human sources. And after all, we have about 60,000 former Afghan soldiers and intelligence and security operatives, policemen, many of whom we could have asked to stroll by that villa and actually verify that al-Zawahiri was there. I don't know that that's the case, but I'm hypothesizing. Also, the U.S. intelligence community from the start was able to track the movements of al-Zawahiri's wife, daughter, and grandchildren to Kabul, which of course kind of put a target on al-Zawahiri's back. I wonder, especially given that in these types of operations, human intelligence has to play a key role, where possible should play a key role. I wonder how effective the over-the-horizon will be in less permissive rural environments where it's much more difficult to get eyes on the ground, where it's impossible to track the movement of family members, where key terrorist leaders are not going to sort of reveal themselves.
Bruce, can you explain for those non-al-Qaeda experts what you mean by the over-the-horizon strategy?
Well, this is the strategy that the Biden administration argued enabled us to withdraw from Afghanistan. In other words, the U.S. counterterrorism capabilities, which I don't doubt have become so sophisticated as they clearly have over the past 20, even 30 years, but that we didn't need troops or eyes on the ground any longer, that we could do this, we could fight this war by long distance. Again, my response would be exactly as we tried to do it in the 1990s, and that didn't work out so well, but obviously there are other people who have a different opinion. So it's basically using signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, drones to carry out attacks that you don't need the boots on the ground, and maybe in certain unique circumstances, although it's hard to imagine them now because there's no real geographically contiguous bases. I mean, the United States military could not stage another, raid on Abbottabad like we did in 2011. It would be much more difficult. So we're really fighting this remotely. Maybe it will work. I'm skeptical, mainly because terrorists are always deliberately evolving in such a way as to obviate whatever countermeasures we attempt to apply to them. And that's why I think targeting al-Qaeda outside of sort of Tony, Kabul suburbs or Kabul neighborhoods and villas in more rural areas where intelligence is hard to come by, I think would be more challenging. So the question is, who will succeed Ayman al-Zawahiri? Three candidates have more or less been proposed in various literature. Saif al-Adil, we'll come back to in a second. Abdul Rahman al-Maghrabi, or a sort of dark horse candidate, Amin Muhammad al-Khan, who actually is an Afghan, like al-Zawahiri, is also a medical doctor, has been a key player in al-Qaeda for many years. But I mean, I'll be honest, I haven't heard about him at all. Not that that means anything, but I hadn't heard about him until a very excellent article in War on the Rocks last month discussed why he could be a candidate. My guess is it'll be Saif al-Adil, and even if it's not al-Adil, he will have an outsized role in al-Qaeda. He's kind of the movement's forced come in a way. I mean, he can claim to have been present at all the key junctures in al-Qaeda's history. He was instrumental, for instance, reportedly in training the Mujahideen how to use surface-to-air missiles in the 1980s. He was instrumental, reportedly, a decade later in Mogadishu training the militia forces of the warlord Muhammad Farah Aidid how to use rocket-propelled grenades to shoot at the tail rotors of helicopters. And anybody who's seen the film or read the book Black Hawk Down knows how tragically decisive that was. Played an important role in the 1998 embassy bombings, the planning of the USS Cole, actually had opposed the 9/11 attacks. Being the loyal foot soldier he saluted smartly and played a role in its implementation. Was very important in enabling bin Laden and al-Zawahiri to flee Afghanistan once Operation Enduring Freedom commenced, organizing the fighting around Kandahar, the rear guard that presented them the opportunity to flee. He was al-Qaeda's main liaison with Hezbollah, with Iran, Quds Force and the Revolutionary Guards in the 1990s. That's why he fled to Iran after Operation Enduring Freedom. Mentor and tutor to Hamza bin Laden, and someone who thought the 9/11 attacks would be dangerously counterproductive and argued for continued focus on what was proving very successful al-Qaeda in the 1990s, targeting embassies and commercial aviation. And I imagine that's what we're likely to see a return to in the future. I'll say one more thing about Saif al-Adil, why he's my leading candidate, at least, is because he spent so much time with the African affiliates of al-Qaeda, which are so important right now. He became conversant in languages there and also established very close relations with them. And we have to think back that both Bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri were racists. It was years before they let al-Shabaab join the al-Qaeda fold. They always looked down upon the Africans in a very supercilious manner. Saif al-Adil has none of that baggage. So if he is made emir, but even if he's not emir, he'll be a key advisor that I believe will steer al-Qaeda in a different direction. At least when I look towards the future, one of my biggest concerns is the threat to commercial aviation, not least since Saif al-Adil always thought that was the most lucrative target for al-Qaeda. And here I've talked about this in past Jamestown Foundation webinars. We shouldn't forget the February 2016 attempted in-flight bombing of the Dalo aircraft that had departed from Mogadishu en route to Djibouti. This was proof positive that the bombing expertise of Ibrahim al-Asiri, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula's key bomb maker, had migrated to other al-Qaeda affiliates. In fact, not that this means anything, but in my view, al-Shabaab is the least technologically proficient of all the al-Qaeda affiliates. They're great with AK-47s and technicals, but they were the last group I would have imagined would be using a bomb concealed in a laptop to try to smuggle it on an aircraft. So if al-Shabaab is interested in targeting commercial aviation, I can't imagine that the more sophisticated al-Qaeda franchises aren't similarly interested. And just to make the hair on our arms stand up, twice in the past 3 or 4 years now, 2 members of al-Shabaab have been arrested, one in the Philippines and one in Africa, undertaking the same kind of flight training that the 9/11 pilots undertook. Again, in my, and actually I should have said it's nearly 50 years, I'm not that old, studying terrorism, but in the abiding well of my pessimism about terrorism, I can't imagine that there's only 2 people out there taking these lessons. So that's very, very alarming. For al-Qaeda's part, there's some indication that its external operations planning has already commenced. In July 2021, several al-Qaeda operatives were arrested in Lucknow, India, planning simultaneous suicide attacks for the Indian Independence Day. Roughly 6 months later, in other words, an effort by al-Qaeda to replicate the 2001 attack on India's parliament to the 2008 Mumbai attacks, both of which nearly drove the 2 nuclear powers of the Indian subcontinent to warfare and then perhaps to a nuclear confrontation, which is exactly what al-Qaeda wants. So those are the known unknowns. Let me very quickly talk about, in the remaining minute or so, the unknown unknowns. Since the invasion of Iraq, no one likes to talk about WMD and terrorism anymore. And I remember in the 1990s, this was precisely the issue that preoccupied certainly the Clinton administration, but also terrorist analysts everywhere. There may not have been WMD in Iraq, but everything we know about al-Qaeda's ambitions in the unconventional weapons realm before 9/11 shows that it had interests not just in chemical, not just in biological, not just in radiological, but also in developing nuclear weapons. Now, admittedly, its nuclear weapons development, research and development, or pipe dreams, it never got very far, but they were quite serious. But at least in my discussions with people who know much more about these kinds of weapons than I do, al-Qaeda was about 2 years away from weaponizing anthrax. And that's quite alarming. In fact, they had, not only were they interested in all 4 of the letters that go into the CBRN weaponry, but they often had multiple locations in highly compartmentalized programs competing against one another. So for instance, in the case of anthrax, it's their camps or their facilities at both Toronto and Kandahar competed with one another who could get there first. I have always said that terrorists are most dangerous when they have access to sanctuary and safe haven, precisely because they can engage in these types of activities. You fuse that with the Taliban-ruled Afghanistan, perennially unstable Pakistan, and interest in facilitating the TTP's, the Pakistani Taliban's ascension to power, and Pakistan's own nuclear arsenal. And you have a convergence, I think, of a number of worrisome factors. And again, Mike can correct me about this because all my information may be dated or limited, but my understanding is that even at the height of our cooperation with Pakistan, we were never allowed to inspect any of its weapons facilities and to assess how safe its nuclear weapons were. And we know on a daily basis, these weapons are in transit in Pakistan because the Pakistanis are trying to avoid fixed locations that either the United States or especially India could detect. So as we know, these types of weapons or any goods are most dangerous when they're in movement. So the unknown unknowns is, will al-Qaeda resurrect its interest in the CBRN realm across the board as it once so actively pursued them before 9/11? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bruce. That is really a nice kind of review of the known unknowns and kind of charting the course for how we look at the future of al-Qaeda. And we'll come back in the question and answer session. Mike, the floor is yours. What you're going to talk about how USCT policy was affected, but you can feel free to kind of comment on some of the things that Bruce also said.
Yeah, will do. Thank you, Glenn. So yes, not surprisingly, I agree with everything Bruce said. Bruce, is the preeminent terrorism scholar in the world, and we definitely see these things eye to eye. So piggyback in terms of counterterrorism strategy, what worked, what hasn't worked over the last several decades. Bruce really hit the nail on the head as to what's most important, and that is to deny sanctuary to these global jihadist groups, particularly those with global ambitions rather than regional ambitions. When we haven't denied sanctuary pre 9/11, certain periods after 9/11, as al-Qaeda migrated from Afghanistan to Iran, but mainly to Pakistan, first in the settled areas and then into the federally administered tribal areas. The threat to the American homeland went up dramatically between 2003 and 2008. You may remember 2006, we had the transatlantic bomb scare where al-Qaeda operatives wanted to blow up 10 airliners over the Atlantic, and it was fortunately foiled by very good intelligence. And some of those plotters had come out of Pakistan as well, and some were homegrown in the UK. That's why we have these TSA restrictions that are still with us to this day to counter that. And when we have denied sanctuary, we've been very successful. Overall, U.S. counterterrorism policy since 9/11, generally a pretty good success. There hasn't been a major attack on the U.S. homeland, and we have done a pretty good job of disrupting and dismantling core al-Qaeda and then some of its affiliates, but not all, but not strategically defeating them, as Bruce said. So what are some of the kind of keys to success? Well, first off, counterterrorism operations are intelligence driven, both by human intelligence, but also technical intelligence, SIGINT and imagery intelligence and others. And then the ability to reach into ungoverned spaces, Afghanistan, Pakistan border region, much of Yemen, parts of Syria, instruments like the Predator unmanned aerial vehicle, armed reconnaissance has been absolutely critical. That's probably our most important weapon that we've had in the war with al-Qaeda the past 20 years. And then partners. After 9/11, we really expanded our global terrorism partner network across the world, Europe, the Middle East, and that disrupted a number of plots. Al-Qaeda still had a lot of mobility, but with intelligence, again, we were able to get partners to arrest them et cetera. And so then as you look at counterterrorism strategy going forward, you have to say, well, are these things being eroded in some way? Or we have fewer partners or less cooperative partners or less ability to do this armed overwatch with predators, or will our intelligence be as strong as it's been? And will our fundamental strategy be to deny sanctuary? So this policy really worked best between 2008 and 2012 or so, when we really broke the back of poor al-Qaeda in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region. You know, I think it was in late 2010, Ayman al-Zawahiri said al-Qaeda had to go to ground. They just could not sustain planning or operations or training in the border region, and they would try to wait us out. There were a series of innovations. I don't want to go into them all because they're all described in my forthcoming memoir. So you can read it there if you like, but the national security team of President George W. Bush put in place a lot of these things in the summer of 2008, and they were sustained by President Obama with great effect. So let me then turn to sort of the present day, which is beginning with the Afghan withdrawal. And I would agree with Bruce that over time, this withdrawal will hurt us on a number of levels. One, we lost some very important real estate. Yes, you can do over the horizon operations with some degree of success, but it's much better to be as close to your target as you can, to have bases, you spend more time on target, you know, with airplanes, et cetera. But you also have a local partner that can do operations and collect intelligence for you. And then also your intelligence just gets much better when you're on the ground, able to run sources directly or collect technical intelligence from closer range. Your just intelligence gets a lot better. CIA Director Bill Burns has talked about this in testimony that, you know, over time our ability to monitor our intelligence will degrade and will be less effective. It doesn't mean we won't be effective at all, but we will be less effective over the area. You know, Zawahiri was a tremendous intelligence success and tremendous targeting, precision targeting with the predator. But that's early on after the withdrawal, when one can expect a lot of sources are still in place, a lot of capabilities that would likely atrophy over time. And then there's the shot in the arm to the global jihadist movement. I mean, it's horrible to say that al-Qaeda and the Taliban won. I mean, it just drives my soul to say it. But that's certainly the view of the global jihadists. And that's something that, again, will embolden them after a series of setbacks. And then Bruce talked about WMD, and of course, having bases and presence in Afghanistan, doesn't have to be a large presence, helps in that regard too, particularly if there were a concern with Pakistani loose nuclear weapon, probably the most dangerous WMD threat we have that could fall into radical hands. Much better to be close to the target. And then if you look around at al-Qaeda's affiliates, we've done a good job, a slower job of battering al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, who became a very dangerous threat after 2011 and became the world's most sophisticated terrorist bomb factory with Ibrahim al-Asiri that Bruce mentioned. We suffered a setback there in 2014 when the Houthis took over. And so while we've degraded AQAP over the last decade or so, taking out a number of leaders, Qasem al-Rimi and others, the Houthis only have so much control over the area. We're again in an over the horizon posture. And so that will pose challenges for us over the long haul. And the same is true to a lesser degree with parts of Syria. And then Bruce mentioned that formerly regionally oriented groups like al-Shabaab and maybe al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb and some of the others may take on more global ambitions. And then we would face a similar challenge there. Everything else you agree with. The prisoner release has just compounded our problem. The long relationships with al-Qaeda safe haven providers, the Haqqani network, and particularly Sirajuddin Haqqani, will all over time strengthen them. My betting too is on Saif al-Adil. I mean, he's in Iran right now, but he's been an al-Qaeda strategist and he's been involved in lots of things. Abdul Rahman al-Maghrebi is someone we've also followed for a long time. He's Zawahiri's son-in-law. He's a media guy. He's one who's been reluctant to take on higher leadership roles in the past. So I would be surprised if he did it here. I guess there's another of bin Laden's sons that's in Afghanistan, Abdullah, or I forgot the name, but maybe they'll do him over time. And then I agree with Bruce on Amin Mohammed or Hassan Khan. It sounds like he has a great resume, but he wasn't on my radar screen in my decade going after al-Qaeda. So I kind of wonder about his prospects as well. So with that, I think I've hit all the main points. Let me pause there and look up your questions.
Okay, great. Well, thanks. I've got a lot. And one of my questions to both of you is that it's taken a while since the death of Zawahiri. We're now, it was in August. Here we are on middle of December. There's still no successor to Zawahiri named. Is there an advantage to al-Qaeda in delaying this? Is the delay intentional? Does there some type of purpose involved where it allows them to kind of quietly keep regrouping without drawing a lot of attention? What would be the strategy for the silence and the delay? Bruce or Mike? Well,
I was surprised. I thought for sure that they would announce the new emir around the anniversary of the September 11th attacks because it was Arba'in, the 40-day mourning period for Muslims. So I'm still scratching my head of why that didn't happen. I mean, Mike suggested that Saif al-Adil is still in Iran. My understanding is that 2002, Mullah Omar gave him Afghan citizenship, so he can come to Afghanistan anytime he wants. The question is, being let out of Iran. I don't know. I'm perplexed by that. I don't have an answer.
Mike?
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm perplexed too. I mean, they've only gone through one succession. The last succession was kind of preordained. They had a concentration of people in an area where they could do that in 2011. So this one is more challenging. As Bruce mentioned, the Taliban may be wanting to keep a lid on things right now. So it's possible al-Qaeda hasn't announced it, but it's actually occurred. Certainly from the outside, we don't.
Do you think that Saif al-Adil, who is one of the leading candidates, will keep staying in Iran, or is there a benefit to staying in Iran for him? I mean, he survived this long, in Iran, or is he going to want to escape to somewhere in Africa where it might be safer to operate? Just you're guessing.
I think he'd leave Iran. I don't think Iran is a very comfortable place for him. Over the past 20 years that he's been there, he hasn't enjoyed freedom of movement. It's gone between house arrest. Now, admittedly, he was able to orchestrate al-Qaeda's short-lived terrorist campaign in Saudi Arabia in 2003. But no, my guess is that he would, again, this is just a guess, that he would go to some rural area of Afghanistan. That's one of al-Qaeda's pathologies, in my view. It doesn't have many of them. One of them is that their obsession with Afghanistan. And I think the sense of security they have there, but this comes from the black flags from Khorasan. I mean, it's just like this emotional attachment to it. So that's another reason I think he would go there. I think he'd be much too vulnerable. Firstly, the Iran and Afghanistan have contiguous borders. So the ease of crossing it, he's already crossed it, I would argue, many times probably over the past 20 years. the further he would run, the more vulnerable he would be. And I don't think this, the only place conceivably, but I think this is even an outlier that he could go to in Africa would be if Mali happened to fall to JNIM. I mean, now with the French have pulled out, if the Wagner group, for instance, was yanked out by Russia to go fight in Ukraine or something, it could be that Mali would fall apart quickly and could conceivably become another jihadi state. But and that, that's what terrorists want, safe havens. And just as Mike and I have been saying,
But they also want areas where there's good infrastructure as well, right? Cell phone. I mean, Mali doesn't strike me as being.
no, that's right.
very
That's
good.
exactly right. That's why Afghanistan, I mean, at least I haven't been to Afghanistan now for over a decade, but back in the late 2000s, I had better coverage there than I did in the DC area.
Mike, how would you, did you want to say? Comment?
Yeah, no, I agree. If he's not in Afghanistan already, that's his most likely destination, safest. The further he goes, the bigger the risk. And so the only thing that would stop him, I think, is if the Iranians, and I don't think they have great incentive to want to do that right now. So
Do you think the Iranian government's also kind of playing with this a little bit to wanting, you don't think they're wanting some concessions from the Biden administration? Or
I
you
don't
would-
think this is an issue. They've had kind of a more tolerant and a less tolerant approach with al-Qaeda going way back pre 9/11. Sometimes they let them cross the territory and go elsewhere. Other times they restrict them on house arrest. And so it's not the ideal environment, certainly, for an al-Qaeda senior leader, but it hasn't been bad. Iran had allowed a number of leaders to transit through Zahedan to the Pakistan border, Baluchistan, and then up into Pakistan. I think Saad bin Laden, if I remember right, and others went that route. So I don't think right now it doesn't seem like it will make a lot of sense.
Okay, you were, I assume in your new book that's coming out, by all means available, that you will talk about the killing of bin Laden in the book, I assume.
Yes, there's two big chapters on finding him and killing him.
Two
yes.
chapters,
Yes,
okay.
and there's plenty of chapters on.
And
the
they've all
global
been
fight
cleared
against
by the
al-Qaeda.
censors.
They've all been cleared
Okay,
by
great.
all the relevant censors in the U.S. government.
So are you going
Places
to
I've
give us a
served.
taste of what,
I already
what
have.
oh,
but,
you-
there's plenty more. My editors and publisher.
they want you to say, remain quiet.
There's
So
things-
even for Jamestown, you won't give
Even
us
for
a.
Jamestown as a board member, I will
All right,
respect
well.
my publisher's wishes.
Okay, so going back to when you were there, then I can ask you some questions when you were there in the room when it all happened. I assume that when his death occurred, everyone's going through their minds, okay, we got him, now what? Now what will be the US strat? I mean, I'm surely at that time, it started evolving in your minds when you're director of intelligence at the Pentagon, that what type of al-Qaeda strategy would follow after that. Did you immediately assume that Zawahiri would be, the baton would be passed and that it would mean more of possibly what?
So as I mentioned, a couple things are relevant here. One, we had already really battered al-Qaeda pretty hard as I said, Zawahiri issued the order to go to ground in late 2010, before the bin Laden raid in May 2011. And so, and we continued that through 2012, 2011, 2012, quite intensely, and then started reducing substantially the number of strikes 2013 to 2017. A function of one, how battered the group was, but also policy change to have less reliance on that. So the other thing is the surge in Afghanistan was coming to an end, the big buildup of forces that President Obama ordered in December 2009, and actually had begun earlier with the first tranche of forces in the spring. And so our drawdown was just starting in Afghanistan. And then, yes, we thought.
So you were kind of worried about what that would mean?
Over the long haul, but not immediately. I mean, the immediate effort was to focus hard on continuing to batter al-Qaeda. But the other issue that is really relevant is our relations with Pakistan were really deteriorating. And so beginning actually again in 2010, we had quite a close relationship with the Pakistanis on counterterrorism, counterinsurgency cooperation between 2008 to 2010. We were training a lot of their forces. We were building training areas along the border. We had a special forces command in Pakistan. And then the Pakistanis, the army started restricting visas on anyone connected with counterterrorism. So that presence really was drawn down by
So it
Pakistan.
affected you inside of
It
Pakistan.
affected our ability, it affected cooperation, also stopped in terms of capture operations. So we had captured a lot of al-Qaeda leaders up through 2010, including current leader of the Taliban and others. And that kind of cooperation was going down. And then right before the bin Laden raid, we had a US government contractor who was involved in a shooting incident. A couple of guys on motorcycles tried to rob him and defended himself. He was in jail. It took a lot of effort to get him out. And so our relations with Pakistan had kind of fundamentally changed, not 100%, because we were still able to maintain operations, as I said, through 2012 quite intensely, but everything else was shutting down. The assessments at the time were that, bin Laden's death was a big loss because he was charismatic, and that, but Zawahiri would carry on. There might be somewhat of a different focus, but the combination of the effectiveness we had against core al-Qaeda and then getting bin Laden really looked like, if not a defeat for al-Qaeda, at least a turning point that might put them closer to the path of defeat, if I remember what the language has been, and our language was at the time. And so that's kind of how we saw the situation.
So there was a deep sigh of you were relaxing.
I wouldn't go that far.
Okay.
Well, because the threat in Yemen was growing, the threat in Syria was growing, Zawahiri saw Syria.
So you saw something else different.
Going as well, but the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region wasn't done either, as I said. It was just that this was another blow to al-Qaeda.
Does anybody have any questions in the room? We have some people attending today. Anyone? Okay, Stan, please identify yourself. You're now retired.
I'm now retired.
Good for you.
Happily fooling around. Infiltration. Al-Qaeda had 2 successful attacks against the United States, both the result of infiltration of security agencies. The incident in Khost, when the CIA had its worst day in history. They infiltrated the Jordanian security. The Jordanians thought they had a real plan, it turned out to be al-Qaeda. And then Pensacola. They infiltrated the Saudis and so on. I have this cockroach theory. If you see one cockroach, probably have more than one cockroach. The unknown, this is one of the known unknowns. I can't believe these are isolated guys. And these are 2 critical countries, Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Note that the king of Jordan is afraid of a coup. He put one of members of the royal family under house arrest. He is afraid of a coup. I put that together with costs, and I wonder, should we be taking a closer look at Jordan? That is a critical country. The other, of course, is Saudi Arabia. Remember, King Faisal was murdered by his nephew. Bin Salman has alienated a lot of people. I look at the infiltration of the Saudi security forces, and I really wonder if that incident could not be repeated. These are 2 critical countries. I would take a closer look at the infiltration.
So the question is on infiltration, Jordan and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, so al-Qaeda had, Bruce talked about, al-Qaeda had some success in Saudi Arabia 2003, and it caused a significant change in Saudi policy after that under Mohammed bin Nayef to really tighten down. But al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula still had ability to infiltrate. They had suicide bombing attempt against MBN, and fortunately he survived it. 2009, I believe it
Yeah,
was.
September.
Yeah. And so it's something, conditions for instability are always there to some degree in that part of the world. So you have to worry about that. The Coast case and the Jordanian, I think while his al-Qaeda origins came from his time in Jordan, that's what got him sent there to Afghanistan and to target al-Qaeda senior leaders, and then obviously was went back to them and the tragedy we had in Coast. I think it was more an impact on our operations than broader Jordanian stability. Would be my assessment. That does, now today is we're a long way past the Coast bombings, but and Jordan has plenty of challenges of its own. But that tragedy was more about our operations, I would say, than about broader instability of Jordan.
We've got a question from Matthew Kennedy. How do you see the connections evolving between al-Qaeda and ISIS over the next several years?
Well, I mean, this has been another thing that has interested me. I thought that really the main reason for the split between ISIS and al-Qaeda was the personality clash between Ayman al-Zawahiri and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. They're both dead. So I think in that sense, whatever force of personality had prevented any kind of reconciliation and modus vivendi has been removed. The bottom line is they both have exactly the same ideology. They both have the same strategy, really, and want the same outcome. I think they've differed in sort of style and tone more than in substance or reality. What I've been interested in is that ISIS appears, at least its external operations capability, which was once much, I'd say, more robust than al-Qaeda, seems to have been gutted because they've gone so quiet. Now, again, they're expanding at the periphery, certainly in Mozambique, among other places. They expanded from North Africa to the Sahel and then to Southern Africa. I just saw a statistic. There's been 140% increase in ISIS-K or IS-K attacks in Afghanistan. But the weakening of their, let's say, international capability, especially of their operations in Europe, which once for a time eclipsed al-Qaeda's, may make them more susceptible or amenable to not just the reconciliation, but maybe reunification. And not least because ISIS's third emir was reported killed in battle 2 months ago. I mean, the news just leaked out. So probably the conditions now are more ripe than they've been in the past. But don't forget that even during the first year of their estrangement, there were multiple efforts to kind of bridge the gap. There was almost a coup, in fact, at Raqqa by pro-al-Qaeda elements within ISIS. Most of the implacable opponents of reconciliation with al-Qaeda and ISIS, we killed them all. So the path may well have been, we encounter less resistance now than at any time in the past.
The only thing I would add to that is that when you look at these groups, for instance, some of the fundamentalist Syrian insurgent groups, most hardcore, fighters would go back and forth across groups depending on who they thought had the upper hand and where they would get the best chance for success and most weapons, etc. And so I would, some Pakistani Taliban have gone over to ISIS-K, they could go back. I mean, these groups interbreed a lot, and it depends on who they think, where their best opportunities go. So even if you didn't have a formal reconciliation, which I agree with Bruce, I think is possible, particularly as right now, ISIS core operations in Syria and Iraq aren't, going all that well. You certainly could have just movement of rank and file.
Question here, Jacob.
I just wanted to touch on-
Identify yourself, please, for the audience.
Jacob Zen, Jamestown Foundation Terrorism Monitor Editor. I just wanted to touch on Africa briefly again, leading into the next panel. One thing that Bruce mentioned was emotional attachment, which al-Qaeda has in Afghanistan, and of course they have in the Middle East. One thing they don't have in Africa, I feel, is emotional attachment, although they have everything else. They have porous borders, weapons, poor governance, and they have the largest affiliates there. But do you think that the lack of a emotional attachment might affect their ability to make a place like Mali their main stomping grounds? Perhaps Somalia has some of that historical attachment, but not necessarily Mali, at least not yet. Do you think they can develop it in terms of narrative, or do you think it actually does have more credibility within the movement than I'm giving it? Yeah.
I think it's all personality driven, and if Saif al-Adil becomes Emir, or if he has this influence, I think it would be strengthened. I mean, al-Qaeda was comfortable operating in Africa in the 1990s, not just in Somalia, in Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda. It's not the same, it's not the pathology that I described with Afghanistan, and it certainly isn't like Syria, where there's Dabiq in Syria is mentioned in the Quran, and Damascus is enormously important. But, as Mike said earlier, I mean, going back to Sun Tzu, terrorism flows like water where it can, where it's least impeded. And Africa has become, I think, increasingly attractive to al-Qaeda and ISIS, certainly. There's that historical connection. And things potentially could change. I would say after Afghanistan, at least East Africa, certainly, I think it's very attractive.
Yes, in the back. Yes.
I run the non-state actors program at New Line since.
I'm sorry, can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Tammy Palacios. I run the non-state actors program at New Line Institute down the street. So I was wondering if we could take a case example, kind of leading into a previous question. So there was a recent instance of Boko Haram kind of baiting ISWAP. Hey, we'll join you, and then doing a little bit of a ambush. That kind of those on the ground, those local affiliate interactions between al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates, still having a very strong clash, right? They're not working together by any means. Is that reflective of the larger networks of the relationship, or is that just, should we just read into it as a local instance? If my question made any sense, I'm sorry, I just.
It's hard to say, because of course there was a period in the Sahel in particular where General Anderson, who was the AFSOC commander, this goes back 2020, just before COVID started, it talked about at least this nascent cooperation that never really took out, just as you described, it started and never took off. I think, the likelihood, I don't put it as a higher, I thought it was a higher likelihood years ago that if the two leaders were eliminated, it would happen. I think that likelihood is diminished as time has passed. But I think generally speaking, as a global movement, ISIS is suffering more than al-Qaeda, which was the reverse. I mean, throughout the 2010s, ISIS was in ascendant. And it wouldn't surprise me if it drove them not to reconciliation and not to any kind of a merger, but to some form of strategic cooperation. That I think is entirely possible now. But again, it's all conditional on personalities determine history, or leaders determine history. It depends who succeeds. The last al-Hashemi al-Qurashi was killed in ISIS, and who succeeds al-Zawahiri. You could get two leaders that actually are younger or less encumbered by the baggage of this enmity from before. And again, maybe won't reunify, but are willing to cooperate with one another. Any kind of cooperation, to my view, is actually quite chilling and quite scary.
Do we have a question online from Aaron Davis? Do you want to tackle that, Bruce? It's directed at you.
Sure, it's good. It's good to hear from you, Aaron.
So he says he's surprised that your al-Qaeda known unknown is a turn back to CBRN, which it didn't successfully deploy in an attack, and not looking to leverage more advanced conventional commercial technologies. Quadcopters are easy to use, and their full potential as a weapon is yet to be realized. So jihadis overall have proven to be masters of new, hard to detect explosive mixtures and IED techniques. What about the conventional side is the question.
It's not an either or, it's both. I mean, you're absolutely right, Aaron. And Aaron's one of the finest analysts of terrorism too, just recently retired from decades of service in the US government. I just don't think they're mutually exclusive. And certainly, and that's exactly our problem, is that we have to cover the waterfront in terms of terrorist threats, from like kind of very simple attacks that can be highly effective to more ambitious attacks that may fail. But I would argue that even a credible attempt to use WMD of some sort, I mean, I don't like that term anyway, but just as a shorthand, even a credible attempt to use it would have profound psychological repercussions. And that's always what terrorist groups are aiming at. It would clearly be front page news. And you've hit on, I think, one of the other pathologies of terrorist groups is they believe their own propaganda. They often overreach. And I think terrorists believe if they could get the ultimate weapon, that somehow that would really fulfill all of their ambitions. And that's why they're going to keep, I believe they will keep trying. How successful they'll be, or what the trajectory is of developing some, CBRN capability, I can't say. But if al-Qaeda's previous period of residency in Afghanistan is any indication, they will be very seriously interested in it. And we know ISIS clearly was. I mean, ISIS in these 2 or 3 years that it controlled Mosul made full use of the University of Mosul's CBR, well, at least its professors in the sciences and engineering. So I don't think this is something terrorists have forgotten, but you're absolutely right. They're going to prefer the simple to the more complex, but I wouldn't be overly confident that they forget about the more complex.
One question here, and then we gotta wrap it up.
Thank you. I'm Rafid Jabouri. I'm a journalist, and over the years I've written for the Jamestown publications. It's about Iran and al-Qaeda. Apparently we have all grown a bit casual about the contradiction between the relations between the two countries, the main Shia powerhouse in the Middle East, Iran, in the world, Iran and al-Qaeda, the Sunni jihadist organization. While the Sunni Shia divide is still a powerful dynamic of conflicts in the Middle East. What do you say about the fact that the Trump administration waited until the very last days to announce in detail what it knew about that relations, hosting Saif al-Adil and Abdurrahman al-Maghribi and the killing of Abu Muhammad al-Masri and all that? And that was just part of the rhetoric against Iran, not specifically addressing the threat of the coordination between Shia jihadism and Sunni jihadism. So what do you say, and still continuing, still even seems to me that the Biden strategy against Iran is separate than addressing Sunni jihadism. So is that coordination between Sunni jihadism and Shia jihadism just, are you not amazed by that degree of coordination?
Well, it's been going on for over 3 decades.
Yeah.
It's, Iran, it's not only a relationship with al-Qaeda, but certainly with Hamas and Palestine Islamic Jihad and Muslim Brotherhood type of groups. So, you're right. It's one of the things that doesn't receive enough attention, and I think plays into the stereotypes of the Middle East, or even 20 years after we became heavily involved with ground forces, that we still don't, we still adhere to these mythologies like Sunni and Shia or blood enemies and will never cooperate. And yet, one could argue too, al-Qaeda wouldn't have become as capable as quickly as it did during the 1990s without Imad Munir, without the support of Hezbollah. Clearly, Hamas and PIJ have been transformed by Hezbollah and Iranian support. So, if anything, this relationship, as you know, should really trouble us because of its potentialities in the future, especially at a time when, we read on the front page of the New York Times, at the front page of the Washington Post, how Iran is really ramped up its targeting of dissidents and targeted assassinations, not only of dissidents, but even of other foreign nationals. If they're going back to 2012, if they're willing to bomb Cafe Milano in Georgetown, cooperating with al-Qaeda, that's just so attractive and so easy for them.
Yeah, it's the classic example of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The cooperation waxes and wanes, but as Bruce said, it goes back a long ways. And, at one point, al-Qaeda took an Iranian ambassador hostage and got substantial money for it, but it did impact the overall strategic relationship. And, it's business, not personal, it's business. Now, and then in the view of some al-Qaeda senior leaders, they haven't forgotten the enmity, but they think this is way downstream. It's not their main enemy and they can cooperate now with them.
I mean, that may be an impediment actually with ISIS, because I think ISIS does feel differently about Shia than al-Qaeda does. And of course, al-Qaeda in Iraq, its predecessor in Zarqawi felt very different. So that, that may be the kind of issue that prevents some kind of modus vivendi with ISIS. But other than that, al-Qaeda pure, I agree completely with Mike.
Excellent question. So I think on that note, answering the question about ISIS and al-Qaeda is an appropriate one. The bombing attacks today in Kabul also indicate that Afghanistan is now in its own period of instability and strife between rival terrorist groups. We'll stay tuned. All eyes will be on Afghanistan. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. We'll have a brief intermission for 15 minutes, and then we'll resume the rest of our second panel on Africa with Jacob Zinn and Dario Cristiani. So thank you for joining us today.